I think a lot of people saw this coming as the polls have shifted in favor of Vice President Harris in the presidential campaign right now against President Trump. Now, currently right now where it stands is essentially, we'll go through it spot by spot, kind of really work through it, but essentially it went from a major lead from Donald Trump compared to Joe Biden to now what I predicted, which was going to be just a breath of fresh air. And what could that do for you? And all of a sudden you're in a statistical dead heat with Kamala Harris in most of the major swing states and across the board. And this is what these polls are showing, Will.
That's right. So as you mentioned, there was what was seen and even what was given to President Biden and why he ultimately, as they tell us, felt the need to step aside. There was almost no path forward in the polling for him to win victory in November. But now what we're seeing is now that polls are starting to come out, the Harris campaign is benefiting from basically all of the good, positive stories that a campaign would normally get throughout months of campaigning, whether it be winning the nomination after fighting in the battlegrounds of the primaries, and then getting a positive bump as we see a new candidate, a new face, and then we see what will be a vice presidential pick here in just a few days, as they're reporting that Kamala Harris will be touring swing states next week with a VP candidate. The 7th of August is the deadline when she would have to have named it based off of their virtual convention that they're going to be holding. But now it looks like we'll know this week, potentially, as they plan to tour the swing states. And we're seeing basically, if you look at the general election, most of the polls coming out have it within the margin of error. So a statistical tie between President Trump and Kamala Harris. The swing states have tightened, even ones like Georgia, where President Trump was far ahead when it was Biden on the ballot. We see he's in the latest two polls, he's only up 2 points and 1 point, both within the margin of error. So we see the Trump campaign now doing an ad blitz of over $10 million to try to stem some of this polling, which we predicted would shift when there was some fresh news, fresh face.
Someone not 80. I mean, exactly. I think that was going to happen. And look, I think that you got a long time to course correct here. And it's not even course correction. Like you said, I think it's a lot of people just excited at the opportunity. I think there was a lot of Democrats that just did not want to vote for Joe Biden, and they definitely didn't want to vote for Donald Trump. Now they're given the opportunity to vote for someone with more radical views, which they probably like, plus someone who, again, is not 80 years old. I think that does go a long way. I see a lot of comments, people going, I don't believe the polls and all that. And sure, polling in the last decade, or maybe the last 3 election cycles, hasn't been what it was previously, so there is that. We also are still quite a ways out. What the Trump campaign has to figure out is how to get sort of the media eyes back to them. And when I mean media, I don't even mean media like Fox News, because right now they're doing the coverage of the Secret Service. That's happening right now. Obviously, there's still attention being drawn, but there needs to be something positive, something new to come out of the Trump campaign to get the eyes back to them, because right now you just have sort of the shock of Biden dropping out, Kamala actually having a pretty big run at it, and then you're going to have the vice presidential pick, and of course, headed towards their convention. We also didn't want to forget one of the breaking news items that happened yesterday, and that is that President Biden unveiled his plan to finally reform, if you will, in his words, not ours, the Supreme Court of the United States. This would become with some major changes, and of course, that includes term limits, which would essentially allow every president to get probably 2 picks just based on the time as they would cycle out every 18 years, and a lot of other things, including no presidential immunity or no one is above the law policy. We're going to talk a lot about this and Harry Hutchinson's joining us in studio. I think this is important. We know that likely none of this goes through, that this is a political moment, but it doesn't mean it can't, and it can't set precedent for the future, and it's pretty radical.
Absolutely. And it's an essentially political move. So you can argue that law represents the distinction between civilization and chaos. And so with his new Supreme Court reform proposals, Joe Biden, after being cheered on, of course, by Vice President Kamala Harris, seeks to ignore what is essential in our form of government, which is the separation of powers between the judiciary, the legislature.
Hey, I've never been able to do that, so I get to correct you, Harry. No,
and the presidency. But essentially, what Joe Biden is after, I think, is a power grab, which would limit the free exercise of religion, perhaps open our borders, provide essentially unlimited abortion rights, and a number of other initiatives. So essentially, this is a political power grab. Now, I think in the short run, you're precisely correct, Logan. This proposal is not likely to go anywhere, except it provides a talking point for the Democrats during the election campaign.
It's one that they like right now because they know the Supreme Court's like sort of the boogeyman.
And as we've talked about these polling numbers getting a little bit closer between Kamala Harris and President Trump, what we're also seeing is that the media is giving her a huge pass right now. It's that honeymoon period. Sure. She's the new nominee. It's a very unprecedented story for any of these journalists that are covering this, have never gotten to cover something like this. So they're very excited and writing glowing reviews in many cases of the work.
They didn't get a campaign. They didn't get a primary. So now finally the news has something to talk about.
So at the same time that you have the media giving cover for Vice President Harris, you have the current sitting president of the United States, former nominee of the party, now doing things that give them a platform forward about, look, you don't like the Supreme Court. We don't like how they've helped out Trump recently. So what we're going to do is put this forward. And I don't think I can get it done during my time here, as I am a lame duck president earlier than expected. But now that it's out there, maybe Vice President Harris can if you elect her. I see it as a complete partisan political game that he's playing with a co-equal branch of government to try to rally the base in November to get his vice president elected as president and to carry on that legacy. And we know that she's already endorsed the move, but it's a dangerous situation when they have been calling the end of democracy imminent if President Trump is elected. And now the way that they're trying to tinker with our constitutional government, Harry, it feels like they're playing with our government.
Absolutely. And they're playing really with the fundamentals of democracy. So if you look at the United States Constitution, it was set up so that there were three co-equal branches of government. But now Joe Biden and Kamala Harris want to ensure that effectively the executive branch reigns and they have most of the power. And so, consistent with their focus on so-called threats to democracy, what does Joe Biden really want to do? He wants to ensure that the federal government can limit your speech. So-called hate speech, the category of hate speech, becomes broadened so that you can't say certain things that are seen as offensive to certain communities. And I'm not in favor of expanding hate speech.
Sure. But
once you go down that road, what do? You limit the right to free speech, including freedom of religion and freedom of speech as part of our political discourse.
I think that brings up a very interesting topic. We have a call kind of on. Let's go to Rod, who's calling on line 1 in D.C. Rod, you're on the air.
My question is the Republican Party. When it comes time to go out there and put out information, we just seem not to be able to put the information. You look at the media, you look on the social networks, it's always the Democrats who are always putting out the information to make the Republican side of the House look bad.
Rod, it does seem like that sometimes. It does feel like they get lost, where the Republican commentators, or even I look at some of the comments, and I'm not calling anyone out specifically on our comments, but sometimes the comments get lost in the important stuff.
Right.
You start focusing on the trivial. You start focusing on personal attacks, whether you don't like Harris's laugh or you think she has something silly to say, not acknowledging the fact that you really are going to have to counter them with something more than that. You're going to have to counter them more with policy, what it looks like, what it means to American people, what does it mean to start limiting freedom of speech. Those are the kind of topics that you'd hope would resonate beyond a personal attack. It does seem like sort of the meme culture of conservative internet, while sometimes very funny, loses the facts. And you look at what feels like this. Honestly, most of the time the White House puts out something, it's like the most cringe, awkward video. But Rod's kind of right. A lot of times it is like, but here's the 5-point plan.
Well, and you also have something stacked against you, is that the media is, and currently
biased.
is biased. They are promoting these polls. They are showing that Kamala Harris is a game changer for this election. And when people point to the fact that, she didn't get the votes in the primary when she ran, she had to drop out before Iowa. The DNC is very savvy, and the machine that runs the Democrat Party made this choice because they thought it was their best option to win. So all of that history, one, should be brought up and discussed. But if they're allowed to just keep giving cover, they're going to try to find a way to win. This was their dirty trick of 2024, was getting Biden to drop out and put her as the nominee without her having to receive votes.
Right.
Because for some reason, they believe that she is their best choice in November. And that should be, if you want conservative values, if you want a Republican to win, that should concern you of what do they know that we don't? What is their plan for moving forward and pushing her out there as the candidate that they believe can win? So the memes, the personal attacks, that isn't going to counter whatever they have in store moving forward.
Well, it's not going to win over anyone when you're talking about a small percentage of independent voters, really, at the end of the day, who is whether you're going to be able to motivate people to go vote for President Biden. Now you have a whole group that you can motivate to go vote for someone who's just not Trump and is younger. So at that point, you now all of a sudden the tables got turned. Where it was Joe Biden was the old guy in the race. Now all of a sudden you have, Donald Trump is the old man in the race, and you have a younger, more appealing when it comes to I'd say the mainstream. Because look, Donald Trump, whether you love him or not, you could say is a polarizing figure. Yes. Whether it's the way he speaks, whether what he says, if you agree with it or disagree with it. I mean, half the comments I remember when he was running was, I wish he would get off, social media. Now, of course, that's a small percentage of people, but there's a lot of people that felt that way. I would vote for him, but gosh, he says some crazy stuff. I think that part is that small percentage of people are the people who could vote for Harris, and that's where you got to be very careful, because you start going down that path, then all of a sudden it could quickly snowball. So I'm very curious what the Trump campaign has in mind, again, to get your attention off, especially with some of the people that have been floated out there for vice presidential picks, which could be some pretty big names that could bring a lot more people to the table too. It's going to be a tough time. I think a lot of comments are saying, why would you even give this coverage? What about these polls? The polls are biased. They may be. And look, I think we have some of the numbers of the people who voted. Out of the 2,100 people, this was in, which poll was this here?
So this is a new Harvard and Harris poll that shows that President Trump is leading Kamala Harris by 3 points, down from his 7-point lead over Biden in June. But out of the 2,100 or almost 2,200 respondents that were in the poll, 883 were Democrats, 654 were Republicans, and 544 were independents. So the poll obviously very heavily slanted of Democrat respondents, but the independents having almost as many as Republicans. One, it shows you the poll could be skewed. Yeah. But if the independents are shifting, though, down from a 7-point lead to a 3-point lead, that's where you have to be careful, because the independent vote shifting over to the Democrat from the Republican candidate could be a game-changing thing, which is maybe what they were hoping for when they swapped her out.
Right now, we are in the last days of our midnight deadline is tomorrow for our Life and Liberty Drive. We're still short of our goal. We need you to be a part of it. We're making some real headway, though. Yesterday was big. Let's make today even bigger. Momentum is building. Your donations are critical right now if we're going to continue to fight for your constitutional freedoms. Go to aclj.org or scan the QR code.